During the Industrial Revolution, coal was in huge demand. It was how we heated our homes, generated electricity, and powered the steam engines that allowed us to manufacture goods at much faster and cheaper rates. The first use of coal to create electricity in the United States was in 1882, and by the early 1900s, coal mines throughout the states were in full swing, working round the clock to provide fuel for the country. One of those mine complexes was located in the small town of Monongah, West Virginia, and it was in one of those mines on Friday the 6th of December 1907 that the worst mining disaster in American history would take place. Monongah, with a population of 972 as of the 2020 census, is a very small town that sprung up around the coal-filled hills as a place for the miners and their families to live. It sits along the West Fork River not far from the town of Fairmont. In 1907, the population was higher at around 1800, and many of those living in the town would have been working in the mines. At around 4 AM on that cold December morning, the miners began to wake up and get ready for the day. The 6th of December is also St. Nicholas's Day, so many of them would have spent some time celebrating with their families, especially if they had children. But eventually, the men would have said their goodbyes and headed out towards the mines. It would not have just been the men that left though, and many young boys, some as young as 12, would have accompanied their fathers to work. This was very common in the early 1900s, and these young boys would not always be counted when they was entering the mines, something that would make figuring out how many people were actually inside the mines very difficult later that day. There were several separated mines in the complex, spread out around the West Fork River. Mines 6 and 8 were fairly close to each other, their tunnels divided by a relatively thin wall of dirt, as the main method of extracting the coal in these mines was the room and pillar method. 37-year-old Peter Urban, from Poland, worked in mine number 8. He arrived at work a little before 6 AM, along with his brother Stanislaus. The two of them entered the mine and headed for their work area for that day. The mines were dark and dusty, and the main lighting source was from each of the miners' carbide lamps. Number 8 mine was a maze of tunnels, but the two brothers knew their way around, and so after passing a couple of their co-workers, they reached their worksite. They had noticed that they didn't have any carts for loading the coal, but assumed that someone would be by with one shortly, and so they grabbed their picks and began digging. Workers continued to filter into the two mines throughout the morning, and by 10 AM they had all arrived and were hard at work. Peter and Stanislaus worked until around 20 past 10 when they started to feel hungry, so they dropped their picks and found a spot to sit in the dirt to have their lunch. Meanwhile, over at mine 6, a load of mine carts had been filled and sent up to the surface. Once there, an operator sent the carts over the river to the tipple. The carts travelled over the river on a trestle, and once at the end should have dropped over the tipple so that they could be emptied and sent back to be refilled. However, one of the carts got stuck on the edge of the tipple, causing the train to stop in place. The operator noticed this immediately and watched the carts closely while standing by the derailing switch so he could divert them if needed. After some minutes though, he heard a loud sound come from the fan house behind him and decided to check it out to make sure everything was working as it should. The fan house was an incredibly important part of the mine as it was the only way the miners could breathe down in the tunnels. It acted like a ventilation system, circulating oxygen into the mine and in turn pushing out the deadly gases that accumulated down there. And so, it kind of makes sense that the operator would prioritise checking the fan house over watching the now stationary train carts. Back down in mine 8, Stanislaus finished his food, stood up, stretched, and got back to work, as they now had carts to fill with the coal that they had dug out. Peter sat for a while longer, finishing up his lunch. Before he could do this though, he heard a noise in the distance that set his nerves on edge, and he suggested to his brother that they should run. Having not heard this noise though, Stan ignored his brother's worries and continued his work. Shortly after this, however, a second noise, much louder than the first, sounded throughout the mine, followed by the earth shifting all around them. Warm air blasted past them, extinguishing their lamps and plunging them into darkness. At this, both men took off running as the ground rumbled beneath their feet. Earth, wood and mining gear was thrown around the tunnel, and in all the chaos Stan lost his footing, tripped, and slammed headfirst into the ground. Peter turned to his brother, begging him to get up and keep running, but Stan had fallen unconscious, having sustained a very serious head injury. Unwilling to leave his brother, Peter simply crouched beside him and closed his eyes, expecting the ceiling to collapse in on top of them any second, burying them alive. Moments earlier, back on the surface, the connection between two of the stuck train carts had snapped, sending them hurtling back down the trestle towards the entrance to the number 6 mine. The operator, who heard the commotion, came running out of the fan room and sprinted towards the derailing switch, but he didn't reach it in time and the carts went barrelling past him into the mine. Moments later, a deep, rumbling explosion could be heard from the depth of the mine. The train carts had collided with a wall, and it is thought that this damaged some of the electrical wiring sitting there, causing a spark which took hold of the giant dust cloud that had been kicked up and igniting it. Coal mines are notorious for having pockets of gas known as fire damp. These gases can be trapped in between the coal itself or the surrounding dirt, and when these pockets are penetrated, they are liable to explode. This can create a chain reaction if the initial explosion is big enough, and unfortunately, that is exactly what happened in the case of Mine 6 and 8. The initial explosion blasted through the lower layers of Mine 6, causing the vast majority of the higher levels to cave in and demolishing the partition between the two mines. Most of the men and boys down there would have been killed instantly, either by the force of the explosion, the following inferno, or by the shafts collapsing in on them. The blast forced dust and debris up out of Mine 8 with such force that it tore the entrance gate and surrounding concrete out of the hillside and flung the 10-ton fan outside with such force that it landed on the opposite side of the river. Those in the surrounding area would have had just enough time to realise that Mine 8 had exploded when another deafening boom rang out. This time, the area around Mine 6 erupted, sending dirt and wooden beams hurtling through the air. Some reports even stated that several bodies had been ejected from the mine in the same way. The blast could be heard from miles away, and many in surrounding towns felt their homes shake as if experiencing an earthquake. Those living in Monongah knew that this was not an earthquake, and began rushing towards the mines where many of their husbands, brothers and sons had been working. They would get there to see smoke pouring out from between the rubble that was now blocking the entrances to both mines. The force of the blast also blew the roof off Mine 6's fan room, which rendered the fan itself useless. This meant that any men that had managed to survive the explosions would very quickly run out of usable oxygen, as now both of the mine's fans were unusable. Along with the usual gas risk associated with unventilated mines, the explosion would have created what is known as afterdamp, which is a lethal mixture of gases created by the explosion of fire damp containing high levels of methane. It was for this reason that workers immediately began trying to rig a makeshift roof for the fan house outside of Mine 6, in an attempt to buy time for those who may still be alive down in the darkness. They did this even as the ground continued to shift below them as smaller explosions and cave-ins shook the mines. Men also began working on a new structure outside of Mine 8 to hold a new fan should they be able to find a replacement. At around 20 to 11, 10 minutes after the first explosion, 4 miners from the number 8 mine managed to dig their way up through a crack one of them had spotted on a previous day. The 4 were badly injured and had already inhaled a lot of the toxic gases from inside the shafts, but managed to tell the quickly assembling rescuers that there were others alive down there. By 11:05, just 35 minutes after the explosion, a temporary roof had been constructed over the fan and it was restarted. The hope was that this would pump fresh oxygen into the mine, giving the rescuers time to find and save any men trapped alive. Unfortunately, the explosion had blown out the divide between the two mines, and so the fan was unable to provide enough oxygen to displace the buildup of gases produced by both of the mines. Despite this, the rescuers, many of whom were miners themselves, either from the Monongah mines or other mines in the area, decided that they would enter the mine shafts and search for survivors. A group of them entered into the number 6 mine, stepping over splintered wooden tools. Heavy dust stuck to their skin as they squinted into the darkness. They carried safety lamps, specifically made to be used in environments with a lot of coal dust and other highly flammable materials. They followed along the same tracks that the runaway train carts had earlier and eventually found what remained of those carts. The metal had deformed and buckled under the impact, each cart slamming into the one in front of it until all that remained was a large mass of tangled metal. And that mass was blocking the only exit out of the mine. One of the rescuers managed to burrow his way through some of the wreckage, but the air that swept out of the opening rendered him unconscious in a matter of minutes. So the group quickly concluded that any men who had survived the explosions would by now have perished due to inhaling the toxic gas, and so they made their way back up to the surface. Outside, a large number of doctors and nurses from neighbouring towns had descended on the area, ready to help in any way they could. They had quickly set up a makeshift hospital in the blacksmith shop outside of mine number 6, and it was here that their unconscious rescuer was brought to be treated. They were busy trying to prepare for any survivors that would be brought, but unfortunately their services would be almost completely unused. Peter Urban, who was now sat atop his brother's back in pitch blackness, had somehow managed to avoid being swallowed by the raging fires, the collapsing ceilings, and the deadly gases. He could hear another worker groaning somewhere near him, but he couldn't see any of his surroundings. He didn't know if Stanislaus was alive or not. His brother hadn't moved an inch since they had been plunged into darkness, and Peter couldn't bring himself to check, too scared that if he moved the wrong way he might brush up against a wall and cause it to come crashing down on top of them. And so, he sat perfectly still in the darkness, staring into nothingness. His eyes stung, but he couldn't tell if he was blinking or not. Every creak and shudder as the mind shifted had him holding his breath. He sat this way for about 5 hours, listening to the pain groans of the other trapped miner grow fainter and fainter. Rescuers would re-enter mine number 6 and make their way over the crumpled train carts, blocking off as many tunnels as they could before that point to increase the effectiveness of the fan, hoping to push oxygen further into the shafts. They would find the first bodies not far from the carts, and many more would be found further down the tunnel. A temporary morgue was set up in the nearby bank building, and coroners prepared for what was to come as the first reports came out containing the estimated figures of those entombed in the mines. Over 300 men had been on the register, which was not necessarily up to date, and did not include any of the young boys that had accompanied their fathers to work that morning, and so it was feared that the real number would be much higher than that. At around 3:30 PM, a man ran over to the rescue crews and told them that he had heard moaning coming from underground. A team quickly formed and they headed over to the area to investigate. What they found was a deep hole in the ground, and without thinking of their own safety, a group of the men used ropes to lower down into the abyss. They dropped down 30 metres before they hit solid ground, and once there, they followed the groaning sounds until they found the Urban brothers. Peter, who was still sat atop his brother, became uneasy when the rescuers approached. His hours in the darkness, along with the fear of death that had been looming over him, had set him on edge. He didn't want to leave his brother, and when the rescuers pulled him away from Stanislaus, he tried to fight them. Peter didn't speak much English, and the rescuers didn't speak Polish, and so they were unable to tell him that they would also be bringing Stanislaus out and not leaving him in the mine as Peter had thought. Stan, who was lay motionless in a puddle of water, was still alive at that moment, and so the rescuers set about moving him out of the mine shaft and up through the hole. Unfortunately, he would pass away during the trip to the surface. Peter, who had continued to fight rescuers on the surface, was looked over by a doctor, deemed to be fit, and sent home. This gave people hope that others would be found alive, but unfortunately, that would not be the case. The man that Peter had heard moaning not far from him was dead by the time he was found, but his body would be recovered and sent to the temporary morgue. By 5 PM, efforts had shifted to removing bodies from the mines, as the crews inside had stated that there was no chance of finding anyone alive inside. As the sun began to set, the families of those trapped inside refused to move, and instead stayed stood on the slopes in the freezing December air. Rescue crews continued to work throughout the night and the following days, but no more people would be found alive. Many of the men killed in the disaster were from other countries, including 171 Italians, and several memorials have been created in their memory. The official number of dead is 361. The 4 miners that escaped would succumb to their injuries, leaving Peter Urban as the lone survivor of the disaster. He continued to work in mines for the rest of his life, and would sadly be killed in a mine collapse at age 56. In the years following the Monongah Mining Disaster, America would undergo a huge overhaul in safety standards in their mines, leading to the creation of the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910. And while there would be other disasters in the country, they would start to become less common and less deadly as time went on. Hopefully, as we start to move away from using fossil fuels, we will be able to put these types of disasters behind us. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave a comment down below if you have any suggestions for future videos. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.